Okay, so I'm going to talk about some work that we did on intersectional stigma. Um, so I guess just to get us started, so intersectionality is a framework for understanding the experiences of people who live at the intersection of multiple marginalized social positions. And so we apply this a lot in our work with LGBTQ populations, particularly those who are also part of additional marginalized groups like racial and ethnic minorities. And I do a lot of work on multi-level understandings of intersectional stigma. So that goes all the way down to like day level or event level measurement, which is what I'm going to talk about today, and then all the way up to structural level. So looking at state policies and laws and how those flow down to the individual level and to the event level. So a lot of my work has been on event level measurement of the influence of stigma. And that started with sexual minority stigma, and then we translated that into HIV stigma, and then wanted to try to transition that into getting an intersectional understanding of the experiences of Black, Latino, and multiracial sexual and gender minorities. So for event level measurement, we're doing things that are typically like daily diary or ecological momentary assessment, where people will complete one or more. We've done up to 4 surveys a day that sample what things they've been experiencing on a given day. And so we are looking at these intensive longitudinal data within people over some period of time. And there are lots of benefits of doing event level measurement, especially for things like stigma, where people don't have the greatest recall of what kinds of experiences they've had. So a lot of the discrimination literature, for example, has been based on the everyday discrimination scale. The everyday discrimination scale typically asks people about their experiences over the last 3 months, which is a pretty long amount of time to ask people to recall the types of experiences that they've had. So the event level measurement allows us to capture within person variability, right? So every individual person, some people are more likely to experience stigma than other people, which is an individual difference. But even people who experience lots of stigma have days that are worse and days that are better, and people who experience very little stigma have days that are worse and days that are better. So event level measurement allows us to capture both of those things simultaneously, keep apart the individual differences from the event level impact of an experience that is better or worse than what I usually experience on a given day. And so we had done prior work that validated the use of event level measurement to capture stigma, but there were a lot of problems with that, especially because most of our measures of stigma and discrimination are based on extreme experiences, right? So like things like physical violence, which luckily most people don't experience on a daily basis. And so when you're asking things that are at that kind of extreme on a really frequent basis, not surprisingly, the reports of those types of things are very low, which is good. We don't want people to be experiencing those things frequently, but that does cause measurement issues, right? Like you have very skewed data when you're capturing things that are very rare over, for example, 30 days or 42 days, which is how often we typically do these types of assessments. So we applied for a grant. NIMH had put out a call for stigma measurement, intersectional stigma measurement grants back in like 2018 or something like that. So we applied for an R21 to take what we had done previously with sexual minority stigma and HIV stigma and try to create an intersectional stigma scale that could be used at the event level that would improve upon the psychometric issues that we had seen previously in stigma measurement at the event level, and B, turn that into intersectional stigma as opposed to just assessing one domain of stigma like HIV, for example. So we proposed a 3-phase study. We started with a systematic literature review and qualitative interviews, and then that's what I'm going to be focusing on today is the stuff that we learned in that. And then from there, we took that information and we developed a set of items, and then we put the items through 6 iterations of cognitive interviewing with the same population, and then did a daily diary validation study And this study was conducted among Black, Latino, and white sexual minority men across the United States. And initially, we expected that the way that this would work is we would capture intersectional stigma by capturing the unique way that stigma manifests itself in the lives of Black sexual minority men versus Latino sexual minority men versus white sexual minority men, with the idea that a lot of people have talked about in intersectionality, that these things can't be teased apart. So you can't have some items that are based on sexual identity and some items that are based on Black race and some items that are based on Latino race, but really that those things combine in ways that can't be separated. And so the qualitative interviews were really designed to try to generate like what those items should look like. What do people's experiences look like in an intersectional way that kind of acknowledges that they are experiencing stigma based on more than one factor at a time. And so how do we capture that in quantitative items, which is not a super easy thing to do. So that was the first aim, and then we went on to do the daily diary study that I won't really talk about today, but I'm happy to discuss at any point in time. So for phase one, we did qualitative interviews, and we split them between community-based experts, so people that just have lived experiences from these three groups, Black, Latino, and white sexual minority men in the United States. This was a nationwide study that we sampled from one of our nationwide cohorts. So we invited people that were in the cohort to participate in this measurement study. And then we also sampled research and academic experts who do work in intersectionality or who work with populations that experience intersectional stigma. And I'm going to talk about a couple of the different themes that we identified during these qualitative interviews that ended up being a little bit surprising to us, just based on the way the literature had been framed up until this point. So not surprisingly, and totally in line with intersectionality, intersectional identities are inextricable, right? So people talked about the fact that if I'm a Black sexual minority man, I don't go into one space as a sexual minority and another space as a Black man. I'm always in all of the spaces that I'm in as a Black sexual minority man. They also really highlighted that intersectional identities provide opportunities for resilience and resistance. So basically what we did was we asked people for feedback on scales of intersectional stigma. So we asked them to talk about like what issues they've faced in trying to respond to these types of items in the past. And this was one of the things they said, like, don't ask us only about problems. Like, being a Black sexual minority man is also amazing in all of these ways. And so, like, don't only ask me about the bad things, because those bad things are offset or helped to generate within me, like, a sense of resilience and shared identity with other folks. Identity salience is context dependent, and space and place are critical. This was one of the really big ones. There's now a lot more work in the role of space and place within stigma, and how spaces and places sort of become a key measurement domain for the experience of stigma. But at the time, this work hadn't really been popularized or hadn't really been published on a lot. And then a lot of talk about process, not content. So we asked people to describe, like, how would stigma look different for you as a Black sexual minority man versus a white sexual minority man, or versus a Latino sexual minority man? And people weren't actually able to describe those experiences in ways that suggested that we should have different items for different groups of multiply marginalized individuals. They talked more about the ways, and tying back to place, that these things, it's more about the impact as opposed to the content of the stigma. So I'll talk a little bit more about all of these things. So starting with intersectional identities are inextricable. Again, anyone who's familiar with intersectionality, none of this will come as news to you. In some cases, for some people, stigma experiences may be attributed to a specific identity, but this is overly simplistic. And most people, when they're asked about their experiences of stigma, don't think that it was only because of one aspect of their identities. So one person said, racism persists in queer spaces, and that has a strong effect on people's identities. Even when you order your own identities, people have to recognize that other aspects of your identity can have an impact on your other identities. And we hear this a lot, right? That, some people identify more strongly with some of their identities than others, right? So like we heard from a lot of the Black sexual minority men that like their race is their strongest sense of identity, and that their sexual identity comes after that, but that doesn't mean that they're able to disentangle the experiences in their lives and attribute them to one of those things versus the other. So don't ask us about our experiences of racism in a way that doesn't acknowledge that we're also simultaneously experiencing anti-LGBTQ stigma. And then another person said, the way we experience the world is a result of all those identities being intersected. Because of the intersecting identities that they hold, the social locations they hold, that stigma can happen in. So we shouldn't promote the idea of someone being only one part of themselves. And we shouldn't ask them to explain their experiences in reference to only one part of themselves, because people don't think of themselves as these individual segments. They think of themselves as whole individuals. The next big thing was this idea of resilience and resistance. So focusing only on the negative impact provides an incomplete picture of stigma's impact. So you'll hear like all of these different things are really about how do I respond to things that acknowledge my wholeness as a person, as opposed to dividing me up into all these different segments. And this is one of them, right? Like I'm not someone who only has negative experiences. So that's another piece of acknowledging my whole identity, is also asking me about the different types of experiences that I have, both positive and negative. So one person said, the people that I'm closest with and my strongest relationships came out of shared stigma, even if it wasn't something I was personally stigmatized against. There's a sense of camaraderie. Shared intersections of stigma, I feel like, is linked to community, solidarity, friendship, and a shoulder to cry on. Stigma is a beautiful glue. So the one that was more surprising was, and not surprising, but the one that we were sort of expecting the least and hadn't really planned to create the items to reference, was the role of space and place. So we heard that there was a tension between racial, ethnic, and sexual identities in some situations, but intersectional stigma has to do with how a person interacts with not just other people, but their environments and their contexts. So the vast majority of stigma literature has been based on social interactions, right? So like, what did you experience when you interacted with these people? But participants talked a lot about the ways that they felt walking down the street. They weren't interacting with a specific person. There wasn't even like necessarily one specific person looking at them in a certain way, but they felt more stigmatized in some spaces than in others, or they felt like they belonged in some spaces and not others. And this was a range of different things. This could be their workplace, but it could also be their neighborhood, or it could be a subway station. We had people from all across the country, so some people had those kinds of commutes and others didn't. So one participant said, having the capital to go to spaces that may be more accepting than others, or the resources to access the support to express yourself or feel you can be who you are. So this was a really big thing. Is that, stigma is sort of the corollary to privilege, right? So folks that have more privilege, one of the privileges is not experiencing stigma. And so folks talked a lot about the ways that people who don't have intersectional stigma have spaces where they can ignore their identities, where their identities don't have to be salient for them. But folks with multiple marginalized identities have very few, if any, spaces where at least one of their stigmatized identities is not being made salient, and they don't feel negative as a result of at least one of them. So another person said, we take publicness and public space for granted, but minority people who sit at intersections, these kind of privileges of walking or traveling, or even the notion of public space, doesn't seem like they have the privileges or rights to. Public space is made for men, straight, white, gender conforming. It is embedded in who we understand is deserving of those spaces, right? So even the white sexual minority men in the sample, so the sample was stratified by race, the white sexual minority men would talk about how gay spaces, traditionally gay spaces or queer spaces, were safe spaces for them, where they would be able to feel like they could be their true, authentic selves. Was like something that people would say a lot, like I could be myself. I didn't have to worry about, the way that I acted in the same way that I do when I'm in like traditional straight spaces. But the Black and Latino sexual minority men didn't feel the same way, because when they were in traditionally queer spaces, they still felt a lot of racism. So there was this idea that there's like no safe space, and that is kind of a hallmark of intersectional stigma is that it's not the way the stigma looks, it's how pervasive it is across my entire life, that I don't have anywhere that I can go that at least some aspect of myself is not being stigmatized or monitored or judged. And then another big thing was process, not content. So a lot of our stigma measures ask about the content of people's experiences. Did you experience violence? Did you experience name calling or bullying? Did you have someone like, you know, in a store who was watching you more closely than other people? Those types of like really concrete content related experiences, and folks really pushed us to think more about the process and the impact of more generic everyday situations as opposed to these discrete stigmatizing manifestations. So one person said, speaking from a personal perspective, we're not unidimensional, we have multiple identities, and stigma can be experienced differently at different points in life. So I also just wanted to briefly bring up a few of the quotes that we got around ethical considerations given where we are today. So these are 3 different quotes that we heard people talk about. We didn't actually specifically ask people to talk about ethical issues in stigma measurement, but we did ask them about their experiences and how we could do stigma research in a way that doesn't reinforce stigma or make people feel badly about themselves. And so these are 3 of the quotes that we got in those types of questions. One person, and this was, I believe, one of the experts that we asked, like one of the researchers, said, participants often wonder, who are you? How do you relate to me? Why should I share with you? What is this data going towards? Is it to elevate a PI's career or to implement a policy and intervention that will ultimately help the communities we're working with? So the idea that the way that I respond to the questions that you ask me is going to be based on what I assume you're going to do with that information. So, you know, really highlighting the value that we place in people's personal experiences, the kind of mental effort that it takes for people to share that information with us, and making sure that we then safeguard that information and use it in ways that are consistent with the needs of those populations. Another person said, understanding the emotional impact for someone of talking about an experience for which they didn't have language. What is the aftermath of these questionnaires? How can we avoid re-traumatizing people? And this is really important, especially for event level measurement. So one of the things we wanted to do was come up with a sort of common way of defining intersectional stigma for people so that we could then ensure that there was a consistent shared understanding for people to be responding to the items with. That's like, you know, a big thing in cognitive interviewing is making sure that everybody understands the questions in a similar way and understands the response options in a similar way, so that when you're looking at their quantitative responses, they mean the same thing across different people. Because that's a huge issue that we have with stigma measures is some people will read an item and think one thing, and other people will read an item and think other things and respond in very different ways to the item, which then totally invalidates, you know, the content of what you're capturing. And so this was a really important point, especially for what we were trying to do, because we actually ended up shifting away from defining intersectional stigma in the first place. So where we landed from all of these qualitative interviews is that we actually don't tell people about stigma at all. We don't make the questions about stigma. So we ended up developing 2 scales, one that was about their feelings and social interactions, and one that was about their feelings in different spaces and places that day. And we never once mentioned the word stigma. So we did, as part of this, create an adapted version of the everyday discrimination scale that did define stigma, but during the cognitive interviewing, that scale was viewed very negatively, which is like problematic given that the vast majority of the discrimination literature is based on that scale. We went through 6 rounds of cognitive interviewing and we were still getting feedback on ways to improve that scale after we had improved it over 6 different iterations. Whereas the items that didn't ask for people to make the cognitive attribution of their experiences to stigma and just acknowledge that these are the experiences that they have based on who they are as whole people, worked out a lot better. And then get community members involved and stakeholders who embody the lived experiences we are trying to capture before developing it. So I think, you know, this really spoke to not just the role of CABs, but also, you know, we started talking about this a little bit yesterday, like in hiring members of the communities to be on your research teams and to get the training to someday become the researchers themselves, right? So that members of communities are working with their own communities. So, like I said, what we ended up doing is we actually kind of scrapped the idea of developing an intersectional stigma scale that asked people about intersectional stigma, defined intersectional stigma, and asked people about it. We did do that, and then during the cognitive interviewing, we decided like that wasn't really the direction we were going to go. So we ended up with two scales, one that defined for people what we mean by social interactions, and then asked them about like 18 different positive and negative feelings that they had across all of their social interactions that day. And then another that defined spaces and places for people, and then asked them similarly about the feelings that they had across spaces and places across their day. So first and foremost, for daily and event level studies, avoid focus on extreme experiences. So things like violence. People, like I said, fortunately experience physical violence relatively rarely. It's not a great item to include in an EMA study. A, because you're going to so rarely get positive responses to that it's easier to ask that kind of question retrospectively. But also because it's very traumatizing. And so like people who are doing a survey once a day, twice a day, 4 times a day, don't want to be asked all day about their violence, their experiences of violence. Because even if they haven't experienced it, it can trigger memories of prior experiences of violence, for example. Avoid trying to tease apart identities or isolating the driving factor. This has been a huge thing in stigma research, is this idea of like, which of your marginalized social positions is the driving factor in your negative health outcomes? Is it racism, or is it anti-LGBTQ stigma, or is it gender-related stigma, or gender expression-related stigma? Is your socioeconomic position? I mean, even the everyday discrimination scale, if you've taken it, asks you at the end to attribute your responses to one or more of your identities, right? So like there's this idea that we are pitting stigmas against each other to figure out which one's worse. And participants really talked about the ways that that is not helpful, that they don't care which one is the worst because they're impacted by all of them. And so like this idea that we should have an HIV stigma scale and a sexual identity stigma scale and a racism scale, and then put them all on a model together to see which one comes out to be independently associated with the health outcome. They were like, that's ridiculous. Like my experiences of stigma are my experiences of stigma, and you should not prioritize addressing one over the other. You should address the structures and the systems that reinforce stigma in the first place, regardless of the identity. Because, you know, oppression is created by the same structures and systems, whether it's focused on racial and ethnic identities or sexual identities or gender identities, etc. Another big one was that quantifying stigma should go beyond tallying up the frequency and range of experiences. So that's obviously one of the main things that we've done in stigma, is like, how often do you experience these things? And that's the score that we get, right? Like these people experience stigma more often than these people. And folks, you know, really talked about the ways that it's not about how often I experience it. It's about how pervasive it is, right? It's also not about like how extreme the experience is. One person experiencing violence once every 6 months might actually not be nearly as problematic as someone who experiences low-grade stigma in every environment that they encounter on a given day, that they can never escape that except when they're at home by themselves. Add a focus on both positive and negative responses to stigma. Consider not just social interactions, but also the relations to space and place. A general sense of safety and belonging within spaces is an experience of privilege. So this was something that we heard a lot. Like the white sexual minority men didn't talk nearly as much about like things like being on the street or being in a subway station as some of the Black and Latino sexual minority men did, because they were experiencing public spaces in a different way, whereas folks that were white sexual minority men, particularly in places like New York City, where there, I think actually it may have gotten a little bit worse again, but like at the time, things were, I think people were feeling a little bit safer as LGBTQ people in places like New York City or other big cities across the country, DC, Atlanta. So there was just this greater acknowledgement of the spaces that a person was in, that the racial and ethnic minority, sexual minority men, just like remembered way more of the spaces that they were in that day. We wouldn't expect that people are actually in more or fewer spaces in a given day, but there was a greater awareness of the different spaces that people were in because of this monitoring that folks are having to do within those spaces, and adapting their behavior to try to increase their own safety, or just sense of belonging within a space. Consider indirect capture of intersectional stigma, which is what we ended up doing. Do we even need to ask people to think about their stigmatized identities? Doesn't that just re-stigmatize people? And if it does re-stigmatize people, we need to consider the risks and benefits, right? Like if it re-stigmatizes them, but it leads to really great data, then maybe there's good cause because the benefits may outweigh the risks. But we didn't get a sense from the qualitative interviews that there was actually benefit to doing this. People basically said, like, when you ask me to attribute my experiences to stigma or to one of my identities or even to multiple of my identities, I can't think about it in that way. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a researcher, like I don't think about my life in the way that you are thinking about my life. I don't know how to answer these scales that you're giving me, right? Like we heard that a lot with the adapted version of the everyday discrimination scale. People were just like, I don't know, like we would ask them to like talk out loud about as they were reading the question and then thinking about what response they would choose, and they would be like, I don't know, like I feel like maybe this experience was because of stigma, but maybe it wasn't. I'm not really sure how I decide if I should count that. And there was like this whole idea, like, does this count? Like people were talking a lot about that. Like, should I count this experience? I don't know. And so this idea that we ask people to attribute leads to a lot of issues with our data, right? Like with our quantitative data, they're unreliable, they're invalid because people don't naturally go through that attribution process. Their experience is their experience. They don't sit down and think, oh, this experience was definitely because of this part of me, and this experience was definitely part of this because of this part of me. And then the last thing was that intersectional stigma is the association and not the variable. So we developed the scale in a way that with event level data we can do this, where people are responding with their feelings in their social interactions and in the spaces that they were in that day. And then we ask them about their affect across the day, so positive and negative affect. And the idea here, which we're just starting these analyses now, is that intersectional stigma is captured actually in the association between their feelings in places and spaces and their overall well-being that day, and not necessarily the scores on their feelings in places and spaces overall, right? So like there's this idea that the scale is capturing one piece of it, but it's really the association, the impact that those experiences have on well-being that is at the heart of intersectional stigma, right? That process or that association is the driving factor, and it's not necessarily just like the score is where you can find intersectional stigma. And then these are all the amazing people that helped to make this study possible, and the NIH funding that we received, and that is all I have.
Thank you, John. Yeah.